Unit 6. Individual Differences. Presentation 2. The Biological Approach to Psychopathology.
In this presentation, we'll be taking a look at what is probably the dominant approach to understanding psychopathology, the biological approach. Psychopathology refers to those behaviours or experiences that would indicate the existence of a mental disorder. In the biological approach, mental disorders are believed to be a consequence of an illness or dysfunction in the body.
What is significant about this view is that mental disorders such as depression and schizophrenia are no different to physical disorders such as chickenpox or cancer, in that all of these are thought to have a physical, biological origin.
Let's begin our examination of the biological approach by looking at genetic influences in the development of mental disorders. Mental disorders such as schizophrenia might be caused by abnormalities in the brain or in its chemistry. But what causes those abnormalities in the first place?
The answer may well lie with genetics. In other words, these abnormalities may be inherited, being passed from parent to child through the genes. Researchers can measure the extent to which two individuals of known genetic similarity are also alike in terms of a specific characteristic, such as depression or schizophrenia.
How would that work?
Well, suppose we found identical twins who had schizophrenia and non-identical twins who also had schizophrenia. Then we could investigate whether their other twin also developed this disorder. Identical twins share 100% of their genes with their co-twin, whereas non-identical twins share only 50% of their genes with their co-twin. As a result, we might expect more of the identical co-twins than our non-identical co-twins to also be schizophrenic, and this is generally the case. This suggests that a genetic influence is at work for schizophrenia, and in fact for many other disorders as well.
So this would also mean that if an individual is diagnosed with a disorder such as schizophrenia, people who are genetically more similar to them, like their cousins, are more at risk of developing the disorder. But the risk would be less for people who share a smaller portion of their genes with the schizophrenic, such as second cousins.
That's right. The more genes that two individuals have in common, then the more likely they are to share characteristics that have a genetic basis. So, if research shows that closely related individuals are also more likely to experience the same mental disorders, then this tells us that those disorders are, at least in part, inherited.
Evaluating genetic explanations of psychopathology. A problem for the genetic explanation of psychopathology is that the evidence for genetic influences in mental disorders is inconclusive. Let's look more closely at the suggestion that a disorder such as schizophrenia is inherited.
If this were the case, then there should be 100% similarity for that disorder when comparing genetically identical twins. Studies of schizophrenia, for example, have generally shown that if one identical twin has the disorder, the chances of the other twin developing it are only about 50%.
So this suggests that environmental influences are at least as important as genetic influences in mental disorders such as schizophrenia.
Yes, it does. It's possible that what is inherited is not the mental disorder itself, but a genetic vulnerability that makes it more likely that this disorder would develop in that individual. So, a disorder such as schizophrenia or depression might only develop if the vulnerable individual experienced some fairly significant life stressors. These might include the death of a spouse, the loss of a job, divorce, that sort of thing.
Could you give us an example of this to make it clearer?
Let's suppose that two identical twins are unfortunate enough to inherit genes from their parents that are associated with depression. We now have two individuals with the same genetic inheritance, but their life experiences may turn out to be completely different. One of these two twins may suffer a major life stressor, such as losing their job or getting divorced, and this acts as the trigger for their depression to develop. The other twin may have no such major stressors, and so remains depression-free.
But what about all those people who lose their job or get divorced, and yet don't develop depression as a result?
Well, we would assume that they haven't inherited the genes for depression, so don't have that inbuilt vulnerability. This means that they can deal with life stressors without sinking into depression. A second aspect of the biological approach is the role of neuroanatomy and neurochemistry in the development of psychopathology. Let's start with neuroanatomy. Abnormalities in the structure of the brain may be what cause the person to behave in a way that others regard as abnormal. Let me illustrate that with an example. Some people with schizophrenia have enlarged ventricles in their brains. These are spaces in the center of the brain, and when they are large, this indicates a shrinkage of the brain tissue around them. This loss of brain tissue may well be responsible for many of the typical symptoms of the disorder. We can then compare the brain scan of someone with a disorder like schizophrenia to that of someone without schizophrenia to see if there's any difference.
You mentioned neurochemistry as well. I'm assuming by this you mean alterations in the level of neurotransmitters in the brain.
That's right. Neurotransmitters are the chemical messengers that carry messages from one part of the brain to another. Abnormal levels of a particular neurotransmitter can result in abnormalities in how a person behaves compared to someone with normal levels of the neurotransmitter. For example, low levels of the neurotransmitter serotonin have been found in the brains of individuals suffering from depression.
Evaluating the role of neuroanatomy and neurochemistry in psychopathology. It isn't always that straightforward to establish a simple cause and effect relationship between the brain abnormalities and psychopathology. For example, we mentioned that research had found that some schizophrenics have enlarged ventricles in the brain, indicating a loss of brain tissue around the ventricles. What isn't quite so clear is whether this loss of brain tissue is the cause of the schizophrenic symptoms or a consequence of them. Research has also shown that loss of brain tissue may actually be the result of taking medication to treat the schizophrenia, so finding that brain abnormalities exist in people with a particular mental disorder doesn't tell us that they caused that disorder.
The final biological explanation is the claim that some disorders might be explained in terms of an individual's exposure to viruses or to chemicals in the environment. Although exposure to viruses or harmful chemicals is a consequence of environmental factors, this exposure causes changes in brain chemistry, which in turn causes abnormal behaviour.
First of all, research has found that in some cases of schizophrenia, mothers have contracted a particular strain of the flu virus during pregnancy. Research has shown that children born to mothers who suffer from flu and other infections during pregnancy are at significantly increased risk of schizophrenia compared to children who are not exposed to viral infection during the first 13 weeks of pregnancy. Research by Paul Patterson and colleagues suggests that as far as schizophrenia is concerned, the risk associated with viral infection during pregnancy was much greater than any known genetic influence.
An example of the influence of exposure to harmful chemicals can be seen in the relationship between prolonged exposure to pesticides and the development of depression. Research has shown that individuals who have used pesticides regularly have a significantly greater chance of being diagnosed with depression than those who have no exposure to pesticides.
Evaluating the viral and chemical exposure explanation of psychopathology. Although there is evidence to suggest that viral infections and exposure to harmful chemicals can contribute to the development of a disorder, it's unlikely that they operate in isolation. It's far more likely that genes and other factors influence this relationship.
For example, people who are regularly exposed to pesticides may be at risk of mental disorders for other reasons that have nothing to do with pesticide exposure. One group of people who are regularly exposed to pesticides are farmers. Some farmers also lead quite socially isolated lives, and research has shown that individuals who are socially isolated are most vulnerable to mental disorders such as depression. Therefore, the cause of their depression may be social isolation rather than exposure to pesticides.
Before we leave the biological approach, we should mention a final objection to the idea that mental disorders have a biological origin and so can be thought of in the same way as physical illnesses. The psychiatrist Thomas Satz argued that, unlike physical illnesses, most mental disorders don't have the same physical basis, therefore should not be thought of or treated in the same way.
Satz also suggested that the idea of mental illness was invented not as a way of understanding psychopathology, but as a form of social control by the state. Labelling individuals whose behaviour is unacceptable as mentally ill allows us to try and change that behaviour through drugs or surgery.
So what can we conclude? As we have seen, the evidence for a biological explanation of psychopathology is, as yet, inconclusive. However, as the technology for investigating what actually goes on inside the brain develops, so will our understanding of the biology of abnormal behaviour.